Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on a journey into the life and, well, truly revolutionary work of Charles Darwin.
Yes, and our source material is a pretty detailed biographical entry.
Right, and our mission is pretty straightforward. We want to extract the most crucial bits of his story, really grasp the core of his world-altering ideas.
And understand their lasting impact. But, keep things engaging. Avoid that dry textbook feel.
Exactly. Think of this as your, well, streamlined route to understanding a figure who fundamentally changed how we see all of life on Earth.
We're here to guide you through the key moments, the key insights.
And we know you value your time. You're curious, you want the knowledge, but maybe not get completely bogged down in endless details.
So consider this your shortcut to understanding why Darwin is still such a pivotal figure.
And just to hook you right in, Charles Darwin is buried in Westminster Abbey. I mean, that alone tells you something about his immense contribution.
A huge recognition. And the core idea that got him there, that profound realization that all living things,
Everything.
from the simplest bacteria to us, share a common ancestry. It's huge.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's start right at the beginning. Charles Robert Darwin, born February 12, 1809, Shrewsbury, England.
And his family background is quite interesting, isn't it?
Oh, very. His father was a successful doctor, also a financier, and his mother, she came from the Wedgwood family.
The pottery Wedgwoods.
The very same. And it doesn't stop there. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was also a significant figure, a real polymath, zoology, botany, you name it.
So definitely a family with a strong intellectual current running through it.
No doubt about it, knowledge was clearly valued.
Right, so young Charles, right from the start, he had this early fascination with nature. Lots of collecting.
Oh, absolutely, a real passion for it. As a child, he was an avid collector. Insects, shells, minerals, all sorts.
And that early drive, that collecting instinct, that became pretty fundamental later on, didn't it?
Completely fundamental to his scientific work.
You
Now,
know,
he did briefly try medicine at the University of Edinburgh.
right, following in his father's footsteps initially.
Sort of. But the lectures apparently left him cold.
Yeah.
And surgery. Well, let's just say it wasn't really for him.
Yeah, I can imagine. Definitely sounds like the operating theater wasn't his calling.
Not quite.
But his time in Edinburgh wasn't a total loss, was it? He picked up a rather useful skill there, I read.
That's right, yeah. He learned taxidermy.
Taxidermy.
Really? Yes. From John Edmonston, who was a freed slave. And Edmonston had actually explored the South American rainforests.
Wow, so that practical skill, preserving specimens, that must have been invaluable later.
Absolutely invaluable for his travels. And in Edinburgh, he also joined the Plinian Society.
Okay, what was that?
It was a student group, really interested in natural history. And importantly, it was a place where some quite radical ideas were being discussed.
Radical how?
Well, ideas about the nature of life, materialism, things that really went against the grain of the accepted views back then.
Interesting. So Edinburgh is a place where these, potentially revolutionary ideas were kind of bubbling under the surface.
They're definitely being floated, yeah,
Yeah.
even if not mainstream. And it wasn't just talk either. He got involved in some actual hands-on study,
Oh, yeah. Doing what?
looking at marine invertebrates, marine life in the Firth of Forth. He actually assisted Robert Edmund Grant with his research.
Grant. Wasn't he interested in Lamarck's ideas?
He was, yes,
Yeah.
a known admirer of Lamarck's theories on evolution. The idea that organisms could pass on traits they acquired during their lifetime.
And Darwin knew about Lamarck through his grandfather Erasmus, too, right?
Exactly. So he was encountering these alternative ideas about how life might change quite early on. It certainly broadened his thinking.
So even though the formal medical studies didn't quite stick, he was already soaking up some pretty cutting-edge biological thinking.
Definitely. But university wasn't all smooth sailing. He apparently wasn't a big fan of Robert Jamison's natural history course.
Oh, why not?
Well, it got bogged down in things like the debate between Neptunism and Plutonism about how rocks were formed. Didn't really capture his imagination.
Sounds a bit dry, I have to admit. More like ancient gods than science.
Right. But he did learn some useful things, like classifying plants, and he contributed to the university museum's collections, which was a big deal.
Okay, so his father, understandably, maybe wasn't thrilled with this lack of medical focus.
Not exactly.
Yeah.
Which led to a bit of a, career pivot.
From healing bodies to tending souls.
You could put it that way. His father, pretty frustrated, insisted he go to Christ's College, Cambridge. The goal: study for a Bachelor of Arts, become an Anglican parson.
Right, a respectable career path. But Darwin wasn't exactly the most dedicated theology student either, was he?
Now, reports suggest he was more interested in riding and shooting,
Yeah.
enjoying the country life.
Sounds about right for a young gentleman of the time. But Cambridge did bring some crucial connections, didn't it? His cousin, William Darwin Fox.
Yes, that was key. Fox really ignited Darwin's interest in entomology, specifically beetle collecting.
Beetles. It sounds almost like a hobby, but it was more than that for Darwin, wasn't it?
Oh, much more. He became incredibly enthusiastic, a passionate collector, and some of his finds, his beetle discoveries, were actually published.
Really? Published where?
In James Francis Stevens's Illustrations of British Entomology. So that was his first real taste of, natural history publication. A big step.
And then came another really pivotal figure at Cambridge, Professor John Stevens Henslow.
Ah, Henslow, yes. The botany professor.
It sounds like Henslow really mentored him, took him under his wing. They even had a nickname for Darwin.
The man who walks with Henslow. That's right. It really speaks to how close they became.
And Henslow introduced him to other leading naturalists. What was their perspective?
Well, mostly they saw science through the lens of natural theology.
Which is the idea
that the intricate designs in nature, the perfect adaptations, were evidence of God's purposeful creation.
Okay. And Darwin was engaging with this. He studied Paley's evidences of Christianity.
He did, diligently, before his final exams. So he was still fulfilling the expected religious studies, even as his passion for natural history grew.
He did graduate, though. How did he do?
10th out of 178 candidates, January 1831. So certainly respectable.
And he didn't leave Cambridge immediately.
No, he stayed on until June. And during that time, he absolutely devoured some really influential books.
Like what?
Paley's Natural Theology, The Divine Design Argument Again. John Herschel's book on the philosophy of science, emphasizing observation and induction.
Okay, scientific method.
Right. And Alexander von Humboldt's personal narrative.
Humboldt's travels. That must have really fired his imagination.
Absolutely. It detailed his incredible scientific explorations. These books really fueled Darwin's own ambitions for scientific travel.
He even planned his own trip, didn't he, to Tenerife?
He did, yeah. To study tropical natural history firsthand. But, well, fate or maybe Henslow had other plans.
What?
The Tenerife trip fell through. Instead, Henslow recommended Darwin join Adam Sedgwick, a top geologist for a geology course.
And field work.
Exactly. 2 weeks mapping rock strata in Wales. That hands-on geology experience turned out to be incredibly valuable.
And this all leads up to the big one, the truly transformative event, the voyage of the HMS Beagle.
The turning point. It started with an invitation from Henslow. Seemed straightforward gentleman naturalist on a ship.
But his father wasn't keen at first.
Not at all. Strongly objected, actually. Saw it as a distraction, a waste of time for a young man needing a proper profession.
So what changed his mind?
It took persuasion from his uncle, Josiah Wedgwood II. He convinced Darwin's father not just to allow it, but to pay for it.
Wow. A 5-year expedition funded by his dad, thanks to his uncle. Crucial intervention.
Absolutely crucial. 5 years. That's a huge commitment for a young man just out of university.
So what was the Beagle actually doing? What was the mission?
Well, the HMS Beagle, captained by Robert Fitzroy, was primarily on a surveying expedition, charting the coastline of South America.
And Darwin's role, the gentleman naturalist.
Basically, yeah. He was the ship's scientist, unofficially. So while the ship did its surveying along the coast, Darwin spent most of his time ashore.
Doing what?
Studying geology, collecting natural history specimens, plants, animals, fossils, across this vast, largely unexplored continent.
It sounds like a dream job for him, despite the famous seasickness.
Oh, he suffered terribly from seasickness, apparently.
Yeah.
But yes, an incredible opportunity. And he was incredibly diligent.
Sending back specimens and notes constantly.
All the time. Meticulous records of his observations, his developing theories, vast collections of specimens, copies of his diaries, all sent back to Henslow in Cambridge.
And remember, while he knew some geology, some entomology, a lot of what he was seeing was completely new.
Entirely new to Western science, much of it. This voyage is where the foundations of his big ideas really started to form.
Like those observations at St. Iago in Cape Verde. That white band of seashells way up in the cliffs.
Yes, that was a really key moment early on. Seeing those marine shells so high above sea level. It just clicked with Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology.
Lyell's book, the one about gradual change.
Exactly. Uniformitarianism. The idea the Earth is shaped by slow, steady processes over vast amounts of time. Seeing those shells high up was like seeing Lyell's theory in action.
And that implied the Earth was much, much older than people thought.
Precisely. Which provided the immense timescale that evolution would need. It was pivotal.
Then on to Brazil. The rainforest must have been overwhelming.
Utterly captivating, he wrote. The sheer variety of life. But he also saw things that deeply disturbed him there.
Like slavery.
Absolutely. He witnessed it firsthand and was completely repulsed. It left a lasting moral impression on him.
Then further south, Patagonia, finding those fossils of giant extinct mammals.
Ethereum, Glyptodon.
Huge creatures. And finding them alongside modern-looking seashells, that must have been a puzzle.
A big puzzle. It suggested these giants went extinct relatively recently, but without any obvious catastrophe. Why?
And crucially, he noticed something else, didn't he? About those fossils and the living animals.
Yes. He saw similarities between the giant extinct forms and the smaller living mammals of South America, like armadillos and sloths. It hinted at a connection, a local relationship between past and present life.
Descent with modification beginning to percolate.
The seeds were being sown, definitely.
And he wasn't just looking at rocks and bones, was he? He spent time with the gauchos.
Right. He explored with them, learned about the land, the politics, the people. He got a real sense of the place.
And he made that observation about the rheas, the flightless birds.
Yes. He noticed there seemed to be two distinct types, or species, of rheas, and their territories overlapped but weren't identical. Another geographical puzzle about species distribution.
More questions about why species are where they are.
Exactly. And further south, seeing those terraced plains, again with seashells, it seemed to challenge Lyell's idea of a single center of creation for each species. Well, finding similar marine life at different heights suggested multiple geological events, and maybe species weren't just created once in one spot and stayed put. It questioned the fixity, the immutability of species.
Then there was the whole episode with the Fuegians.
Ah, yes. 3 individuals from Tierra del Fuego who'd been taken to England, educated, and were now being returned on the Beagle.
What was Darwin's take on that?
It was complex for him. He saw the civilized veneer they'd acquired in England, contrast it with the, well, he called them wretched, degraded native Fuegians they encountered.
Sounds a bit judgmental by today's standards.
It does, yes. But importantly, even with those observations, he still held onto his belief in a common human ancestry, the potential for all humans to be civilized. It shows a real tension in his thinking.
Then Chile, he experienced a massive earthquake there, didn't he?
He did in 1835. A powerful, terrifying experience, but also incredible firsthand evidence of the Earth's dynamism, just as Lyell had described.
And he found more evidence of land rising, shells high in the Andes.
Yes, marine shells way up in the mountains, fossil trees. It all pointed to gradual uplift over immense time.
And it was around this time he came up with his theory about coral atolls.
That's right. Based on his observations of reefs and islands, he deduced that coral atolls form as volcanic islands slowly sink, with the coral growing upwards to stay near the surface. A brilliant piece of geological reasoning.
Still considered largely correct today, isn't it?
It is, fundamentally, a major contribution.
And then the Galapagos Islands. Probably the most famous stop?
The iconic stop, yes. Though maybe not quite the eureka moment it's sometimes portrayed as.
What did he observe there? The finches are famous, but it was the mockingbirds first, right?
Correct. He noticed the mockingbirds differed slightly from island to island, different beak shapes, plumage variations, and they resembled mockingbirds back on the mainland in Chile.
Interesting. Different islands, different variations, but related to the mainland source.
Exactly. And he also learned from the locals that they could tell which island a giant tortoise came from just by the shape of its shell.
But he didn't collect the tortoises properly, labeling which island they came from.
No, not systematically. A mistake he later regretted, realizing the significance. The finches, too, he didn't initially grasp their full importance. He thought they were various types of birds, not all finches.
That realization came later, back in England.
Yes, when the experts examined his collections.
Then on to Australia. A whole different world of animals. Marsupials.
He was quite struck by it. Kangaroos, the platypus, so different from mammals elsewhere. He famously wrote it was like they were made by a different power.
Shows how different environments can lead to radically different forms of life.
Indeed. He also observed the Aboriginal people, noted their cheerful nature, but also worried about their declining population due to European settlement.
And even Captain Fitzroy's work seemed to support Darwin's ideas on coral reefs.
Yes, Fitzroy did detailed studies of the Cocos-Keeling Islands, and his findings on how the reefs were formed seemed to strongly back up Darwin's own theory about sinking islands.
So by the time the Beagle was heading home, after 5 long years, those initial doubts about fixed species had really grown.
Oh, definitely. The mockingbirds, the tortoises, even without perfect data, the Falkland fox, the rheas, the fossils in South America, all these observations were pieces of a puzzle.
And the picture forming was one of change.
It was. The idea that species were static, created once and unchanging, just didn't fit the evidence he'd painstakingly gathered. These facts, he wrote, seem to shed light on the origin of species.
That phrase itself, so the core idea was already there.
The core question, certainly, and the dawning realization that the answer involved transmutation, change over time.
And amazingly, word was already getting back to England, thanks to Henslow.
Yes, Henslow had been sharing excerpts from Darwin's incredibly detailed letters with scientific societies, so Darwin wasn't entirely unknown when he returned.
He even heard a comment from Sedgwick, the geologist.
While docked in Cape Town, yeah. He heard Sedgwick had predicted he'd take a place among the leading scientific men. Imagine hearing that after 5 years away.
Must have been quite something. A sign his work was being noticed.
A huge boost, I'm sure.
So October 1836, Darwin finally returns to England, a seasoned naturalist, loaded with specimens and questions.
And he dove right back into the scientific world. London, Cambridge, connecting with people.
And critically, he didn't have to worry about finding a job immediately, did he?
No, and that's crucial. His father provided financial support. That independence allowed him to dedicate himself completely to analyzing everything, developing his ideas.
A huge advantage. He quickly connected with Charles Lyell, didn't he? The geologist whose book had been so influential.
Yes, Lyell was eager to meet him. Darwin's geological findings from South America provided fantastic support for Lyell's own theories.
And Lyell introduced Darwin to Richard Owen.
Right. Owen was the top anatomist, the expert on fossils and comparative anatomy at the time. Lyell thought Owen could make sense of Darwin's fossil discoveries.
And did he?
He did. Owen identified them as giant, extinct relatives of living South American animals, sloths, llamas, armadillos. This was key evidence for that geographical continuity of species. Life in a place had a history there.
Meanwhile, Darwin started presenting his own findings.
Yes, his first paper was on the gradual geological uplift of South America, and he presented his mammal and bird specimens to the Zoological Society.
And that's when the penny dropped about the Galapagos birds.
That's when the ornithologist John Gould looked at them properly. And Gould realized Darwin's collection wasn't a mix of finches, wrens, and grosbeaks.
It was 12 distinct species of finches.
Exactly. All related but distinct species, uniquely adapted to their different islands.
Yeah.
A massive revelation for Darwin.
Must have been a shock realizing he hadn't labeled them perfectly by island.
A definite regret. But Gould's identification was pivotal. Darwin was quickly elected a Fellow of the Geological Society with Lyell as president.
So he was really being accepted into the scientific elite.
Absolutely. Lyell even presented Owen's findings on Darwin's fossils, emphasizing how they supported uniformitarian ideas about species changing geographically over time.
And all this activity, all this new information, it spurred Darwin to start thinking systematically about transmutation.
Yes. In July 1837, he opened his famous Bee notebook, specifically dedicated to the transmutation of species.
And that's where we find that iconic little sketch.
The first evolutionary tree diagram.
Yeah.
And above it, those simple, profound words, I think.
Chills. Just thinking about it, that marks the real private beginning of his evolutionary theory.
It really does. A deeply personal intellectual journey starting.
He then moved to London to be closer to the action.
Made sense. Early March 1838, closer to the scientific societies, the libraries, the key people, he interacted with Lyell's circle people like Charles Babbage.
The computing pioneer.
Yeah, who had ideas about God creating natural laws. Darwin also lived with his brother Erasmus, moved in his Whig circles, met intellectuals like Harriet Martineau.
Martineau. She was a proponent of Malthus, wasn't she? Population growth.
She was. So Darwin was being exposed to a wide range of ideas, scientific, social, economic.
Now, this idea of transmutation, species changing, it wasn't universally popular, especially with the church.
No, conservative Anglican circles were strongly opposed. But among some leading scientists, there was actually quite a bit of discussion, maybe more than you'd expect.
Really? People were openly debating it.
In certain circles, yes. There was a sense that the old explanations weren't quite sufficient. People were interested in John Herschel's idea that maybe Lyell's approach to geology could help figure out the origin of new species. The mystery of mysteries.
Back to the Galapagos birds for a second. Gould's detailed analysis really hammered home the island-specific variations.
It did. Gould confirmed the mockingbirds from different islands were distinct species, not just varieties, and that wren, Darwin found, was also a type of finch.
Underscoring the importance of isolation, Darwin must have really kicked himself about the poor labeling then.
He did. But luckily, others on the Beagle, including Fitzroy, had kept better notes, which helped reconstruct where things came from. Crucial details.
And the Rheas, too, the two types he saw in South America.
Confirmed as two distinct species with distinct geographical ranges. Another piece of the puzzle about geographical distribution.
So by spring 1837, only about 6 months after returning, his private notebooks are showing he's seriously considering that one species does change into another.
Yes, his red notebook makes it pretty clear. He saw transmutation as the best way to explain these geographical patterns. The Rheas, the relationship between the fossils like Macrauchenia and living llamas.
And by summer, in the B notebook, he's sketching that first tree, moving away from Lamarck's ideas.
Right. He's thinking about how variation happens, how it relates to reproduction, trying to explain the Galapagos tortoises, the mockingbirds, the Rheas, and crucially, he draws that branching diagram.
Rejecting the idea of a linear progression.
Exactly. Rejecting Lamarck's idea of separate lineages all striving upwards. Darwin's sketch shows a single origin, branching divergence. And he writes, "It is absurd to talk of one animal being higher than another. That's a fundamental shift."
Wow. But all this intense thinking, writing, organizing collections, it took a toll on him physically.
Oh, massively. The workload was immense. Finishing his journal, overseeing the expert reports for the big Zoology of the Voyage publication series.
Which he got government funding for.
Yes, £1,000 from the Treasury, a huge sum then. But he was juggling that, his own geology books, his finances. He was constantly overworked.
And his health started to suffer. Heart palpitations.
Yeah, September 1837. Disagreeable palpitation of the heart. His doctors told him basically stop everything. Rest.
Did he? He went to visit his Wedgwood relatives.
That Mayor Hall, yeah. But rest. Probably not much. They were all eager to hear about his adventures. More stimulation than quiet repose.
But that visit did lead to something interesting, didn't it? Something about earthworms.
Yes. His uncle Josiah Wedgwood pointed out some old coal slag buried under layers of worm castings in a field.
Just a casual observation.
Seemingly. But it sparked something in Darwin. The idea that earthworms, over time, could significantly alter the landscape, burying objects, creating soil.
His new and important theory about worms, he presented it to the Geological Society.
He did in November 1837. Shows his incredible knack for seeing the scientific significance in, well, humble worms.
He was still pushing ahead with publications, though. The journal was nearly ready.
By late February 1838, yes. His journal and the first volume of the official narrative were almost done. Fitzroy was still working on his part.
And then he took on another job, Secretary of the Geological Society.
Unbelievably, yes. We will urge him to do it. March 1838. Despite the workload, the fragile health, it put him right at the center of things.
So he's juggling his health, writing official duties, and secretly developing this revolutionary theory. How did he manage the research for that?
He was relentless, actively seeking information everywhere. Not just scientists. He talked to farmers, pigeon fanciers, animal breeders.
Practical knowledge.
Exactly. Trying to understand variation and inheritance from people who worked with it daily. He gathered data from family, staff, neighbors, anyone with relevant observations.
A very broad approach. And his thoughts were turning to humans, too. That orangutan observation.
Yes, March 1838. At the zoo, he noted the similarity between an orangutan's expressions and behavior and that of a child. Early hints of connecting humans to the rest of the animal kingdom.
But the illness persisted. Recurring stomach problems, headaches.
Yes, these bouts started becoming chronic around June 1838. They plagued him for the rest of his life, especially under stress. The exact cause, still debated. Nobody knows for sure.
He took a trip to Scotland that summer. Glenroy.
A geological excursion, yes. He saw those strange parallel roads on the hillsides. His first thought was raised beaches, like he'd seen in South America.
But that wasn't right.
No, he later realized they were shorelines of an ancient glacial lake. But it shows him testing hypotheses, being willing to change his mind.
Then came July 1838, back in Shrewsbury. And those famous notes about marriage.
The marry versus not marry lists. So pragmatic, so Darwinian, even about romance.
What were the pros and cons?
Pros: constant companion and a friend in old age. Better than a dog, anyhow. Cons: less money for books, and crucially, terrible loss of time.
Hilarious and very revealing. But he decided, marry.
He did. Talked it over with his father, then went to visit his cousin Emma Wedgwood on July 29th.
Did he propose right away?
Interestingly, no. His father advised against it, but Darwin actually discussed his transmutation ideas with Emma first.
Sharing his radical, secret theory with his potential fiancé. That's quite something.
Shows the level of intellectual connection he wanted, doesn't it? He valued her intelligence.
And this leads us to another huge turning point, reading Malthus.
Yes, back in London, December 1838, he reads the 6th edition of Thomas Malthus's An Essay on the Principle of Population.
And Malthus argued
That populations, human populations specifically, tend to grow much faster geometrically than their food supply, which only grows arithmetically.
leading inevitably to a struggle, competition for resources.
Exactly. Famine, disease, war. A constant struggle for existence. Malthus saw it as a check on population growth.
And Darwin saw a parallel in nature.
He connected it immediately to what he'd seen in the wild and to ideas like de Candolle's warring of the species in plants. The natural world was clearly engaged in a constant struggle.
And this sparked the big idea, natural selection.
Precisely. Malthus provided the key. Darwin realized, if more individuals are born than can possibly survive, and if individuals vary,
Then those with variations that give them some advantage in that struggle.
would be more likely to survive and, more importantly, reproduce. They'd pass on those favorable traits.
While unfavorable variations would tend to be eliminated.
Right. He called it a wedging action. Nature constantly sorting out structures, adapting organisms to their changing environments. Over time, this final cause of all this wedging, as he put it, could form new species.
He later said the idea hit him in October 1838 after reading Malthus, about 15 months after he started his species notebooks.
Yes, in his autobiography, he pins it to that reading of Malthus for amusement, as he said. The struggle for existence combined with variation, suddenly it clicked. Favorable variations preserved, unfavorable ones destroyed. Result: new species.
And he saw the analogy with what breeders do, artificial selection.
Very quickly, yes.
Yeah.
By mid-December, he saw the direct parallel. Farmers select the best stock, pigeons with desired traits. Nature does the same thing, but randomly, through survival.
He called it a beautiful part of my theory.
He did. And he noted that every part of newly acquired structure in nature is fully practical and perfected through this process.
And that's where the name came from, natural selection.
Yes, drawing that explicit analogy with the breeder's artificial selection, it neatly captured the idea of nature selecting the fittest variations.
Okay, so now he has the core mechanism. He returns to Mayor Hall in November.
November 11th, and this time he proposes to Emma.
And she accepted.
She did. But their letters afterwards show her happiness, but also her deep religious faith. She was a devout Unitarian, and her worry.
Worry about his ideas, his doubts.
Yes, she worried his honest scientific doubts might create a gulf between them, even separate them in the afterlife. It was a source of gentle tension throughout their marriage.
Meanwhile, Darwin's health was still shaky while looking for a house in London.
Yes, the stress wasn't helping. Emma kept urging him to rest.
They eventually found a place, Macaw Cottage.
On Gower Street, yes. Moved his collections and his museum in by Christmas 1838.
And another honor came his way soon after.
Elected Fellow of the Royal Society, FRS, on January 24th, 1839. A major recognition.
And then just days later, January 29th, 1839.
He and Emma married at Maer, a ceremony mixing her Unitarian and his Anglican family traditions. Then off to London to start their life together.
So now he's married, settled, and he has this framework natural selection, his prime favorite idea. What next?
Decades of work. Research, experiments, writing. He needed evidence, mountains of it, to support the theory, refine it, defend it.
What kind of research?
Experimental breeding plants, pigeons especially,
Yeah.
trying to understand variation and inheritance firsthand, collecting data from everywhere, looking for evidence that species weren't fixed, exploring all the implications.
Meanwhile, the official Beagle narrative gets published.
Fitzroy's part came out in May 1839. Then Darwin's volume, his journal and remarks later. The Voyage of the Beagle was published separately in August.
And it was a success.
A big success. Great reviews, popular interest. It really established him as a writer and an observer.
By the early 1840s, he started sharing his transmutation ideas more openly with Lyell.
He cautiously shared them with Lyell around early 1842. But Lyell reported back that his colleagues, the geological establishment, were still very resistant. They objected strongly.
The world wasn't quite ready. Darwin then published his book on coral reefs.
Yes, the structure and distribution of coral reefs came out in May 1842. A major work, took over 3 years. And soon after that, he wrote his first pencil sketch of the natural selection theory.
Getting it down on paper properly.
A more formal outline. And then, seeking peace and quiet for this intense work, the family moved out of London.
To Down House.
September 1842. Down House, in the Kent countryside, became his home and laboratory for the rest of his life.
A couple of years later, January 1844, he took a bigger step. Shared the theory with Joseph Dalton Hooker, the botanist.
Yes, famously writing, it felt like confessing a murder.
How did Hooker react?
Positively. Hooker was already questioning species fixity himself and was keen to hear Darwin's ideas, a huge encouragement for Darwin.
So he kept working, expanding the sketch into a longer essay.
By July 1844, a 230-page essay. He was clearly thinking about his legacy, instructing Emma to publish it if he died prematurely.
He knew how big this was.
Oh, absolutely.
Then later that year, Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation was published anonymously.
Right. Caused a huge stir. Popularized transmutation ideas, but well, Darwin and other scientists thought its science was pretty amateurish.
Bad geology, weak zoology.
That was the view. But its popular success was undeniable. It showed people were interested, maybe made Darwin even more careful about getting his own arguments absolutely watertight.
He finished his third geology book in 1846. And then he got sidetracked, or maybe not sidetracked, barnacles?
Ah, the barnacle years. Yes, his earlier interest in marine invertebrates came back. He spent about 8 years meticulously dissecting, classifying, drawing barnacles from his Beagle collection and elsewhere.
8 years on barnacles. Why? Did it connect to evolution?
It might seem like a detour, but it was incredibly important. It gave him deep, hands-on experience with variation within species, with taxonomy, with comparative anatomy.
Finding homologies.
Exactly. Understanding how the same basic parts could be modified for different functions in related species, evidence of common descent. He also discovered strange things about their reproduction, like tiny parasitic males living on hermaphrodites.
Wow. So it showed intermediate stages in evolution.
It provided concrete examples of gradual modification and diversification. This deep dive really solidified his understanding and confidence in evolutionary processes.
And it earned him serious scientific credibility, too, the Royal Medal.
Yes, in 1853 from the Royal Society. That barnacle work established him as a top-tier biologist, not just a geologist or traveler. Lent huge weight to whatever he'd say next.
In 1854, he joined the Linnean Society, more connections, library access, and he started rethinking his species theory again.
Revisiting it with all this new knowledge. By November, he had a key insight about divergence of character.
Meaning?
The idea that descendants from common ancestor become more different from each other over time as they adapt to different ecological niches, different places in the economy of nature, explaining the branching pattern of the tree of life.
So by the mid-1850s, things are really coming together. He's doing experiments.
Testing seed dispersal. Could seeds survive seawater to reach islands? Hooker was coming around to species change, though Huxley was still firmly against it. Lyell was interested, but hadn't fully grasped the implications.
The stage is set, and then Alfred Russel Wallace sends him a letter.
June 1858. Wallace, working independently in the Malay Archipelago, sends Darwin a manuscript outlining basically the same theory of natural selection.
Oh my goodness. After 20 years of work, Darwin must have been floored.
Utterly shocked. All my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed, he wrote to Lyell. He felt forestalled.
What did Lyell advise? Wallace's paper had come via Lyell, hadn't it? Or Darwin sent it to him?
Darwin sent it to Lyell immediately, as Wallace had asked. Darwin felt ethically bound to publish Wallace's paper. Lyell and Hooker urged Darwin to publish something of his own immediately to establish his long priority.
So what did they do? It was a tricky situation.
And made much worse, because tragedy struck Darwin's family right then. Scarlet fever in the village. His infant son, Charles Waring Darwin, caught it and died within days, late June 1858. Darwin was completely devastated, grief-stricken.
Unbearable. How could he even think about scientific priority?
He couldn't. She left it to Lyell and Hooker. They acted decisively, without Wallace's direct input as he was still overseas.
What was their solution?
A joint presentation. At the Linnean Society on July 1st, 1858, They presented Wallace's paper alongside extracts from Darwin's unpublished 1844 essay and a letter he'd sent to Asa Gray in 1857 outlining the theory.
A compromise, acknowledging both men.
Exactly, ensuring both got credit for the discovery of natural selection. Darwin himself was too distraught to attend the meeting.
And the reaction at the meeting? Fireworks. Revolution.
Surprisingly. Muted. Very little immediate discussion or impact. The Linnean Society president later noted in May 1859 that the past year hadn't yielded any remarkable discoveries.
Incredible. The announcement of one of the biggest ideas in science history, and it barely made a ripple initially.
One professor, Samuel Houghton, later dismissed it as, all that was new was false, and all that was true was old. That was about the most memorable early review for Darwin.
So Darwin, still grieving, still unwell, now had to write up his ideas properly.
He struggled for the next 13 months. It was meant to be an abstract of his planned big book on species, but it grew. His friends kept encouraging him. Lyell arranged for John Murray to publish it.
And that abstract became
On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, published November 2010, 1859.
And the reaction this time?
Immediate sensation. The first print run, 1,250 copies, was oversubscribed. Sold out on day one.
Wow. What made it so compelling?
It was a detailed, powerful argument, packed with observations from breeding, paleontology, biogeography, anatomy. It laid out the logic of natural selection, anticipated objections, provided answers.
Did it tackle human evolution directly?
Not explicitly, no. That was strategic. He knew it was explosive. But he drew parallels between humans and other mammals. He introduced sexual selection, hinting it might explain racial differences. And he famously ended with that single sentence.
Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history.
Exactly. A clear hint of what was to come. But the focus was on the general mechanism.
And the core argument was laid out clearly.
Right in the introduction. More individuals born than can survive. Struggle for existence. Variation occurs. Advantageous variations get preserved, naturally selected. Inherited variations accumulate. Leads to adaptation and new species.
And that beautiful closing sentence.
There is grandeur in this view of life. Captures the scope, the beauty, the interconnectedness with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one.
And that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Just stunning prose.
Absolutely. Though it's interesting, that word evolve only appeared right at the end in the first editions.
Really? He preferred other terms.
Yeah. Descent with modification, transmutation. Evolution had slightly different baggage then, linked to embryology. He only started using evolution more freely in The Descent of Man later and added it to the 6th edition of Origin.
So Origin is out, the world reacts, international interest, debate.
Huge debate. Less overtly hostile, maybe, than Vestiges had faced, but intense. Darwin, still plagued by illness, couldn't really do public debates.
So he followed it all from Downhouse.
Meticulously. Read reviews, scientific responses, even the satires and cartoons, and corresponded constantly with colleagues worldwide, defending, clarifying, discussing.
And the human implications were immediately seized upon, even though he downplayed them.
Oh yes, that was the flashpoint for many. Shared ancestry with animals. That was the big shock for the public and a key line of attack.
Huxley, his bulldog, jumped into the fray.
Absolutely. Thomas Henry Huxley used his supportive reviews not just to champion Darwin, but to attack the old scientific establishment, particularly Richard Owen.
Owen fought back.
Viciously. Owen wrote a scathing anonymous review that infuriated Darwin. Owen and others started promoting alternatives like divinely guided evolution.
What about the Church of England? Was it all opposition?
Not entirely. It was mixed. Some of Darwin's old mentors, like Sedgwick and Henslow, rejected it outright. But some liberal clergymen, like Charles Kingsley, saw natural selection as compatible with God's design as God's mechanism.
Interesting. And there was that other controversy around essays and reviews.
Yes, in 1860, 7 liberal Anglican theologians published essays questioning literal interpretations of the Bible, miracles, etc. It caused a huge uproar, accusations of heresy.
Did that help Darwin in a way?
Possibly diverted some of the theological fire, and one essayist, Baden-Powell, actually praised Darwin's book for supporting the idea of nature's self-evolving powers.
Darwin himself corresponded with Asa Gray, the American botanist, about faith and evolution.
He did. Gray was devout, but accepted evolution. Their discussions seemed to make Darwin more sympathetic to theistic evolution, the idea God uses evolution. Darwin even funded publication of Gray's essays, arguing natural selection wasn't inconsistent with natural theology.
Then came the famous 1860 Oxford debate, Bishop Wilberforce versus Huxley.
The legendary clash. Though maybe slightly mythologized over time, Wilberforce, apparently coached by Owen, wasn't necessarily against all species change, but attacked Darwin's mechanism and especially human descent from apes.
And Huxley's famous retort.
When asked if he was descended from an ape on his grandfather's or grandmother's side, Huxley supposedly replied he'd rather be descended from an ape than from a man who used his great gifts to obscure the truth. Or, words to that effect, became a symbol of science versus religion. Hooker also strongly defended Darwin there.
So even Darwin's closest friends, like Gray, Hooker, Huxley, Lyell, they had some reservations.
Some did, yes. Gray and Lyell looked for ways to reconcile it with faith. Huxley pushed for separating science and religion entirely, but they were all broadly supportive, especially the younger generation of scientists.
And Huxley really took on Owen over brain anatomy.
Yes, the hippocampus minor question. Owen claimed humans had unique brain structures proving their separateness. Huxley systematically demolished those claims through anatomical comparison, showing the similarities between human and ape brains, a major public scientific battle.
So Darwin's theory sparked a whole movement, but with different interpretations.
Exactly. Lyell's book on human antiquity came out, popularizing prehistory but cautious on evolution, which disappointed Darwin a bit. Huxley's Man's Place in Nature tackled human evolution head-on. And Bates's work on mimicry and Amazonian butterflies provided beautiful field evidence for natural selection.
Darwin himself kept working, despite his health, planning more books.
Relentlessly. Even though he was often very ill in his later decades, he still intended to write that big book covering human evolution, society, emotions, sexual selection, botany.
But he got deeply into plants too, orchids.
Yes, starting around 1861. His fascination with insect pollination led to incredibly detailed studies of orchids, revealing their amazing co-evolutionary adaptations with insects. More evidence for natural selection's power.
And he eventually did publish major works on humans, didn't he? The Descent of Man.
Yes, in 1871, finally tackling human evolution directly, including sexual selection as a key factor, and the expression of the emotions in man and animals in 1872.
So he kept publishing right through until his death.
Pretty much. His last book, fittingly perhaps, was on earthworms, revisiting that early interest, published just before he died in 1882.
So at the time he died, how widely accepted was evolution?
The basic idea of descent with modification was accepted by most scientists. Darwin was recognized as the key figure behind this revolution.
Even if natural selection itself was still debated.
Yes, the mechanism was still argued over. But the fact of evolution, largely settled in science. The centenary celebrations in 1909 in Cambridge were huge, a global recognition of his impact.
But then came the eclipse of Darwinism.
Right, early 20th century. With the rediscovery of Mendel's genetics, some scientists felt natural selection wasn't the main driver. They proposed other mechanisms, mutation-driven evolution, Lamarckism again. These alternatives didn't hold up, though.
What brought natural selection back to the forefront?
The work of mathematicians and geneticists like R.A. Fisher. Starting around 1918, Fisher showed mathematically how Mendelian genetics actually provided the mechanism for natural selection to work.
His book, The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection.
Exactly, published in 1930. That, along with work by J.B.S. Haldane and Sewell Wright, reconciled genetics with Darwinism. It created population genetics and led to the modern evolutionary synthesis.
Which is still the foundation of biology today.
It is, the guiding paradigm.
Let's touch on Darwin the man, the family. He and Emma had 10 children.
They did, a large family, but sadly, 2 died in infancy. And the death of their daughter Annie, aged 10, was a crushing blow. It affected them both deeply for the rest of their lives.
He was a devoted father.
By all accounts, yes. Very involved, loving, but also quite anxious about their health. He worried that because he and Emma were first cousins, their children might inherit weaknesses.
He even wrote about inbreeding versus cross-fertilization in his scientific work.
He did, contrasting the potential downsides of inbreeding with the advantages of outcrossing seen in many plants and animals.
Despite his worries, several of his children became quite distinguished.
Remarkably so. 3 sons, George, astronomy, Francis, botany, and Horace, civil engineering, became Fellows of the Royal Society, just like him, and were knighted.
Wow. And another son, Leonard.
Leonard had a varied career, soldier, politician, economist. And he became quite involved in the eugenics movement, mentoring R.A. Fisher, interestingly.
Darwin's own views. On religion, he moved towards agnosticism.
Gradually, yes. From his Unitarian upbringing through grappling with natural theology, the suffering in nature, and the death of Annie, he ended up describing himself as agnostic.
And on human society, he was strongly against slavery.
Vehemently opposed to slavery throughout his life. His views on society were complex, shaped by his time, but he certainly emphasized the unity and shared ancestry of all human races.
Now, his name got attached to all sorts of ideas later on, didn't it? Social Darwinism.
Yes, that's a really tricky area. Darwin's fame meant his ideas, or distorted versions of them, were used to justify all sorts of social and political movements, awful things he himself wouldn't have supported.
Like using struggle for existence to justify ruthless capitalism.
Exactly. Malthus's ideas had already been used that way. After Origin, critics linked Darwinism to laissez-faire economics, colonialism, imperialism. Herbert Spencer's phrase, survival of the fittest, became strongly associated with this, though Spencer's ideas were more Lamarckian initially.
So Darwinism became a catch-all term.
Pretty much. Covering Spencer's ideas, Ernst Haeckel's often racist evolutionary views. It was messy. Natural selection was invoked by capitalists, but also by socialists and anarchists like Kropotkin, who emphasized the cooperation Darwin also wrote about.
Did Darwin himself think natural selection should dictate social policy?
No, he seemed to feel social policy shouldn't be based solely on competition. He valued cooperation and sympathy.
And eugenics grew out of this mix, too.
Yes, emerging in the 1880s, promoted by his cousin Francis Galton initially, it used ideas of heredity, partly inspired by Darwinian concepts, to argue for managing human reproduction.
Though it took different forms.
Right. In Britain, often focused on encouraging the fit, but elsewhere, especially the U.S., it led to appalling things like forced sterilization laws targeting undesirables. Nazi eugenics ultimately discredited the whole field for most people.
And social Darwinism itself became mostly a negative term.
By the 1940s, yes. Used often to criticize laissez-faire conservatives. It's still frequently misused today by people arguing against evolution having ethical implications.
Okay, so let's try to pull the threads together as we wrap up this deep dive. What are the absolute key takeaways from Darwin's life and work?
Well, we've seen his incredible intellectual journey, haven't we? From that curious young collector to the architect of a scientific revolution.
And the core idea, evolution by natural selection. That relentless sorting process driven by variation and the struggle for existence.
And its profound impact, fundamentally changing how we see life, our own place in nature, the sheer depth of time involved.
We saw how those Beagle observations planted the seeds.
How reading Malthus was the catalyst.
And how decades of painstaking work built the case presented in Origin.
A case that, despite initial resistance and ongoing debate about specifics, ultimately transformed biology.
Were there any moments that particularly stood out as aha moments for you during this?
I think the realization about the Galapagos finches, not just varieties, but distinct species, is always powerful. And also that initial quiet reception of the theory at the Linnean Society. Just amazing how such a huge idea landed so softly at first.
It really highlights the difference between the discovery and its eventual impact. The power was in the detailed argument of origin.
Absolutely. It connected so many disparate facts into one coherent, compelling explanation. That's its genius.
And of course, Darwin's ideas aren't just history, they're the bedrock of modern biology.
Completely. Genetics, ecology, medicine, conservation. It all rests on evolutionary principles.
So for our final provocative thought for you, the listener, think about the ongoing relevance of Darwin. We live in a world facing huge challenges. Climate change, pandemics, biodiversity loss.
How can understanding evolution, adaptation, selection, interconnectedness help us navigate these challenges? Can Darwin's insights inform how we respond?
It's a big question. Maybe this deep dive encourages you to explore Darwin's own writings or the modern science that builds on his legacy. There's so much more to discover.
Definitely. How can evolutionary principles guide our efforts towards a more sustainable future, for instance? It's worth pondering.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the life and the incredible enduring legacy of Charles Darwin.
Hope you found it illuminating. Until next time.